A Millionaire's black nurse shows him an old photo that unearths a hidden family past. What long-buried secrets will this image reveal, and how will it impact their relationship? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Parker mansion, where Ethan sat in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the manicured gardens below. The accident 6 months ago had left him with more than just physical injuries. It had erected invisible walls around him, turning his spacious home into an elaborate prison. From his position by the window, Ethan watched the gardener trimming the hedges with mechanical precision. Every day followed the same pattern: breakfast at 8, physical therapy at 10, lunch at noon, and endless hours of watching others live their lives while his remained suspended in time. His laptop sat unused on the mahogany desk, emails from the company he'd built from the ground up piling up unread. The sound of automatic doors sliding open barely registered in his consciousness. The day shift was ending, and the night shift was beginning, another seamless transition in his carefully regulated existence. But this evening brought something different. Instead of the usual quiet footsteps, he heard a confident stride and the rustle of fabric that seemed to carry purpose. Angela Reed entered the room with the efficiency of someone who knew their job well, but there was something more in her presence. She moved with an assurance that came from years of experience, her scrubs neat and professional, her natural hair tied back in a practical style that framed her face. She checked his vital signs with practiced movements, but her eyes held a warmth that contrasted with the clinical nature of her tasks. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice carrying neither pity nor excessive cheerfulness, just straightforward professionalism, "I'm Angela Reed, your night nurse. I've reviewed your chart, but I'd like to hear from you how you're feeling today." Ethan's initial response was to turn away, his standard reaction to new caregivers. But Angela's direct approach gave him pause. She waited patiently, organizing his evening medications, neither pushing for response nor retreating from his silence. "The same as yesterday," he finally replied, his voice rough from disuse. "And the day before that?" Angela nodded, acknowledging his response without challenging its negativity. She moved around the room with purpose, adjusting equipment and checking supplies. "Sometimes the same can be a starting point for something different," she remarked, not looking at him directly as she worked. "My grandmother used to say that even a stopped clock tells the right time twice a day." The randomness of her statement caught Ethan off guard. For the first time in weeks, he found himself actually turning to look at someone who wasn't family or his long-term doctors. Angela continued her tasks, but he noticed how she positioned herself where he could see her easily, adapting to his limited mobility without making it obvious. As the evening progressed, Angela maintained a steady presence that neither demanded interaction nor allowed complete withdrawal. She shared small observations about her day, a story about her nephew's first basketball game, a comment about the changing weather, each one a small thread thrown out that he could choose to grasp or let fall. During one of her regular checks, she mentioned her family Sunday traditions, weekly dinners where everyone brought a dish and shared stories. "Even when life gets complicated, those dinners keep us grounded," she explained while checking his blood pressure. "My mother works 2 jobs, my sister's in law school, and my brother runs his own business, but everyone shows up. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." The mention of family dynamics, so different from his own, stirred something in Ethan. His own family visits were formal affairs, scheduled and brief, filled with uncomfortable silences and avoided glances. The contrast made him think about the world beyond his windows in a way he hadn't for months. As night settled over the mansion, Ethan found himself listening more actively to Angela's occasional comments. She didn't force conversation but left openings for him to participate if he chose. When she mentioned her brother's struggles starting his business, Ethan almost offered advice before catching himself and retreating into silence. But the impulse itself was notable. It had been months since he'd felt any inclination to engage with another person's life. The night shift continued, with Angela's steady presence establishing a new rhythm in the mansion's quiet halls. Her competence was evident in every task, But it was her unforced humanity that began to crack the shell of isolation Ethan had built around himself. She treated his silence not as a wall to break down, but as a space where possibility could grow. By the time midnight approached, Ethan had spoken more words than he had in the past week combined. Each response was brief, often just a word or two, but they were voluntary interactions, small steps away from the complete withdrawal that had marked his recent existence. Angela sat at her kitchen table one Sunday morning, surrounded by boxes of old family photographs her mother had asked her to organize. The morning light filtered through her apartment windows, illuminating decades of memories captured in fading prints and worn album pages. She worked methodically, sorting photos by decade, occasionally pausing to examine images of relatives she barely remembered or had never met. As she reached into a particularly dusty box, her fingers found a thick leather-bound album she didn't recognize. The binding crackled as she opened it, releasing the musty scent of aged paper. Inside, carefully preserved black and white photographs told the story of her family's history in the city. She recognized her grandmother's younger face in several images, her proud stance unchanged by time. Then she saw it. The photograph was smaller than the others, tucked into the corner of a page, as if someone had tried to make it less noticeable. The image showed two women standing in front of a grand house. One was clearly her grandmother as a young woman, but it was the other woman who made Angela's breath catch. She had seen that face before, in a portrait hanging in the Parker Mansion's main hall. The photograph was dated 1952, and on the back, in faded handwriting, were the words, "Sarah and Elizabeth, Victory Garden Fundraiser." Angela knew her grandmother's name was Sarah, but Elizabeth, that was the name of Ethan Parker's grandmother. The resemblance to the portrait in the mansion was undeniable. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the photo from its corner mounts. The two women in the image stood close together, their postures suggesting familiarity rather than the formal distance one might expect given the social dynamics of the time. The house in the background was unmistakably the Parker Mansion, though the gardens looked different from their current manicured state. Angela spent the next several hours examining the album more carefully, looking for additional photos or notes that might explain the connection. Her professional training had taught her to approach mysteries methodically, but her mind raced with questions. How had her grandmother known the Parker family? Why had she never mentioned this connection? And most importantly, should she share this discovery with Ethan? During her next shift at the Parker Mansion, Angela carried the photograph in her pocket, like a secret burning to be told. She watched Ethan as she performed her usual duties, noting how his demeanor had slowly shifted over the past weeks. His respo, and seize, though still brief, came more readily, and he had begun to show interest in conversations beyond his immediate care needs. As she checked his evening medications, Angela made her decision. "Mr. Parker," she said, maintaining her professional tone despite her racing heart, "I found something yesterday that I think you should see." She removed the photograph from her pocket, handling it carefully as she placed it on the table within his reach. Ethan's reaction was immediate and complex. His hand moved toward the photograph, then withdrew as if it might burn him. His face, usually composed, showed a rapid succession of emotions, recognition, confusion, and something that looked like fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my grandmother's album," Angela explained, watching his reaction carefully. "The woman standing with your grandmother. That's my grandmother, Sarah Mitchell." She paused, allowing him time to process this information. They appear to have known each other well. Ethan's fingers finally reached out to touch the photograph's edge. His previous reluctance gave way to intense scrutiny as he examined every detail of the image. "I've seen this house design before," he said slowly. "In the original blueprints. Those gardens, they were my grandmother's pride. She transformed them during the war into Victory Gardens." He looked up at Angela, really seeing her perhaps for the first time. "But I never knew," she never mentioned. The silence that followed was heavy with unasked questions. Angela pulled up a chair, sensing that this moment required her to step slightly beyond the usual boundaries of their professional relationship. "Would you like to know more about what I found?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Yes," he replied, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for what it might mean." His fingers still rested on the photograph, as if maintaining a physical connection to this piece of unexpected history. Together, they began to examine the photograph more closely, each detail raising new questions. The women's clothing, the garden layout, the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun, every element seemed to hold potential clues to a connection neither of them had known existed. Their discussion continued well into the evening, their usual routine temporarily forgotten as they started to piece together a puzzle that had waited decades to be solved. The city library's archive room became their sanctuary over the following weeks. Angela would arrive after her shifts, armed with coffee and determination, while Ethan had arranged for his physical therapy sessions to be scheduled around their research time. The librarian, Miss Henderson, had grown accustomed to their presence, bringing them additional records she thought might be relevant to their search. Their investigation began with local newspapers from the 1950s. The microfilm reader hummed steadily as they scrolled through countless pages, looking for any mention of their grandmothers. Angela noticed how Ethan's hands, usually restless in his lap, would become steady when handling the delicate materials. His business acumen proved valuable as they organized their findings, creating detailed timelines and cross-references. On a particularly promising afternoon, they discovered an article about a community fundraiser in 1952. The piece mentioned Elizabeth Parker's Victory Gardens and their contribution to the local war effort. A paragraph near the end caught their attention. Mrs. Parker's innovative gardening program, assisted by local volunteer Sarah Mitchell, has provided fresh produce for over 50 families in need. Ethan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his expression intense. "My grandmother never talked about the Victory Gardens, except to say they were her contribution to the war effort. But this suggests something more organized, more community-focused." He glanced at Angela, who was already making notes. "Your grandmother wasn't just helping, she was integral to the program." Their research revealed a pattern of collaboration between their grandmothers that spanned several years. Local society pages, usually focused on the Parker family's social events, occasionally mentioned Sarah Mitchell's name in connection with various community initiatives. Each mention was brief, almost hesitant, as if the writers were uncertain how to document this unusual partnership. In the city's historical records, they found permit applications for the Victory Gardens, signed by both Elizabeth Parker and Sarah Mitchell. The documents showed how they had transformed the Parker estate's ornamental gardens into productive farming plots, providing food for families struggling during wartime rationing. "Look at this," Angela said one afternoon, carefully unfolding a brittle newspaper clipping. There was a drought in the summer of '53. The Victory Gardens were one of the few successful growing operations in the county. She paused, studying the grainy photograph accompanying the article. They must have worked incredibly hard to keep everything alive. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk. "My family's wealth came from real estate development," he said finally. "We bought land, built houses, created exclusive neighborhoods. But this..." He gestured at their collected research. "This shows a completely different side of my grandmother's life." As they delved deeper into the records, they discovered more evidence of their grandmother's cooperation during various social crises. During a polio outbreak, Elizabeth Parker had opened parts of the mansion as a temporary care facility, with Sarah Mitchell coordinating volunteer nurses. When flooding displaced families from the Riverside district, both women had worked together to organize shelter and supplies. The weight of these discoveries began to affect Ethan visibly. His usual reserve cracked further with each new piece of evidence they uncovered. "My family's narrative has always been about maintaining social position," he said one evening as they reviewed their findings. "We measure success in acquisitions and influence. But this shows a completely different kind of legacy." Angela understood his turmoil. Her own family stories had always emphasized resilience and community service, but she had never known about this particular chapter. "They found a way to work together despite the social barriers of their time," she observed. "That must have required extraordinary courage from both of them." Their research sessions began to extend beyond the planned hours. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, each processing the implications of what they were discovering. Other times, their discussions would range far beyond the historical documents, touching on their own experiences of family expectations and social pressures. However, as their understanding of the past grew deeper, so did Ethan's anxiety about the present. Angela noticed how he would tense up when library patrons walked past their table, his awareness of public scrutiny seemingly heightened. He began asking her to retrieve documents while he remained in less visible corners of the archive room. One afternoon, after a particularly significant discovery about their grandmother's joint efforts during the drought, Ethan abruptly announced he needed to return home. Angela watched him retreat, understanding that he was grappling with more than just historical facts. The weight of family expectations and societal judgment was becoming increasingly apparent in his behavior. Their research had uncovered a remarkable story of cooperation and courage, but it had also exposed the complex social dynamics that had forced such connections to remain hidden. As Angela carefully packed up their notes that evening, she realized they were uncovering not just historical facts, but also the deep-rooted social issues that continued to influence their own interactions. The first signs of trouble appeared subtly at the hospital where Angela worked. The head nurse began reassigning her other patients, concentrating her duties exclusively at the Parker mansion. During shift handovers, conversations would stop abruptly when she entered the room. Her colleagues' behavior shifted from professional courtesy to careful distance, as if they feared association with her might somehow taint them. The situation crystallized one evening when Dr. Thompson, the supervising physician, called Angela into his office. The room felt smaller than usual, with his large desk creating a barrier between them. "Nurse Reed," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "there have been concerns about your relationship with Mr. Parker." He shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "We need to maintain professional boundaries with our patients. I'm sure you understand." Angela sat straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the composed demeanor she'd learned from years of facing subtle discrimination. "My relationship with Mr. Parker is entirely professional, Dr. Thompson. We've been researching some historical connections between our families, nothing more. Nevertheless," he continued, "some of our more prominent patients have expressed discomfort with the situation." His words hung in the air, their real meaning clear beneath the surface. "Perhaps it would be best if we reassigned you to the general ward." Meanwhile, at the Parker mansion, Ethan faced his own battles. His mother, Eleanor Parker, had arrived unannounced one afternoon, her Mercedes purring up the circular driveway just as Angela was helping Ethan review some newly discovered documents. Eleanor's entrance was preceded by the sharp click of designer heels on marble floors. "Darling," Eleanor called out, then stopped abruptly in the doorway of Ethan's study. Her gaze moved from her son to Angela, then to the scattered papers between them. "I wasn't aware you had company." The pause before the last word spoke volumes. Ethan's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained steady. "Mother, you remember Angela Reed, my nurse. We've been researching some family history." He gestured to the documents spread across the table, attempting to normalize the situation. Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her handbag. "How fascinating," she said, her tone suggesting anything but fascination. "Ethan, dear, could we speak privately?" Her eyes never left Angela as she spoke. In the hallway, Angela could hear Eleanor's voice rising and falling, the words muffled but the tone clear. "Think of the family name board members have been asking questions. Your father would never." When Eleanor emerged, her composure was intact, but her eyes were hard as she passed Angela. The pressure continued to mount from multiple directions. Anonymous letters began arriving at the hospital administration office, questioning Angela's professional conduct. Small items in local society columns hinted at inappropriate relationships within prominent families. The whispers and sideways glances multiplied. One evening, as Angela arrived for her shift, she found Ethan in an unusually agitated state. "The board of directors called an emergency meeting," he explained, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "They're concerned about the company's image." There are suggestions that my judgment might be compromised by my condition. Angela felt the weight of each new development pressing against her chest. Her years of professional accomplishments seemed to dissolve in the face of age-old prejudices. The mundane tasks of patient care became charged with tension, each interaction scrutinized by unseen observers. During their research sessions, now conducted with increasing discretion, they found themselves drawing parallels between their current situation and the challenges their grandmothers must have faced. The Victory Gardens and community projects they had uncovered seemed to take on new significance, representing not just historical events, but a legacy of resistance against social barriers. The pressure began affecting their interaction. Conversations that had flowed naturally became hesitant, laden with unspoken concerns. Ethan started canceling research sessions, citing business obligations. Angela found herself second-guessing every professional decision, aware that any misstep could be used against her. One particularly difficult evening, after another tense interaction with Eleanor Parker, Angela stood at the mansion's windows, watching the same gardens where their grandmothers had once worked together. The weight of history and present-day reality pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had fought hard for her professional position, building a reputation for excellence that she'd thought would shield her from such challenges. Ethan watched her from across the room, his expression troubled. The distance between them seemed to grow with each new obstacle, yet their shared discoveries had created a connection that refused to be easily dismissed. They were caught in a web of social expectations and prejudices that echoed the very history they were uncovering, forcing them to question whether some battles could ever truly be won. The decision to separate came not with a dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet, mutual understanding. Angela requested a transfer to the hospital's general ward, citing professional development reasons. Ethan accepted a new nurse without protest. Their carefully built connection seemed to dissolve into the mansion's shadows, leaving behind only the weight of unspoken words and the scattered research papers neither could bring themselves to put away. In the weeks that followed, Angela found herself drawn back to her community's embrace. Sunday dinners at her mother's house took on new significance. The familiar sense of her mother's cooking and the warm chaos of family gatherings provided an anchor in the storm of emotions she was navigating. Her sister Lisa, halfway through law school, noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. "You're quieter than usual," Lisa observed one Sunday, helping Angela wash dishes while their mother's voice carried from the living room, deep in conversation with their aunt about church business. "Is it about the Parker situation?" The family had heard pieces of the story, though Angela had kept the deepest parts of their discoveries to herself. Angela's hands stilled in the soapy water. The dishes provided a convenient excuse to avoid eye contact. "I've been thinking about Grandma Sarah," she said finally. "About the choices she made, the battles she fought. We found so many stories of her strength, her determination to make change happen despite everything standing in her way." Her mother joined them in the kitchen, having overheard the conversation. "Your grandmother never talked much about those days," she said, reaching for a dish towel. "But she always told us that dignity wasn't something others could take from you, only something you could give away." She paused, studying Angela's face. "Whatever you found in those old papers, remember that her blood runs in your veins." Meanwhile, Ethan's isolation took on a different character than before. Where his previous reclusiveness had been a retreat from life, now it became a space for intense self-examination. His mother's frequent visits brought pressure disguised as concern, each conversation an exercise in navigating around the real issues. During one such visit, Eleanor Parker sat in her usual chair, discussing plans for the upcoming hospital board meeting. "The Thompson family has a lovely daughter about your age," she mentioned casually. "She's just returned from Europe. Perhaps we should invite them for dinner once you're feeling stronger." Ethan wheeled himself to the window, the same window where he had spent countless hours before Angela's arrival. But now his gaze was different, more focused. "Mother," he said quietly, "did you know Grandmother Elizabeth ran Victory Gardens during the war?" The question hung in the air, disrupting Eleanor's carefully constructed narrative. Eleanor's pause was barely noticeable, but it spoke volumes. "Those were different times," she said finally. "Your grandmother did what was necessary during the war effort. But we've moved beyond such arrangements." "Have we?" Ethan turned to face his mother. "Or have we just gotten better at pretending?" The question remained unanswered as Eleanor gathered her things, making excuses about another engagement. In the solitude that followed, Ethan spent hours reviewing the documents they had collected. Each piece of evidence revealed not just historical facts, but a legacy of choices that had shaped not only his family's history, but the very foundations of his current dilemma. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, Ethan's new nurse found him looking through old family albums. Photos of his grandmother in her carefully maintained gardens took on new meaning now that he understood the full story behind them. In one image, Elizabeth Parker stood proud among rows of vegetables, her formal dress incongruous with the working garden around her. The photographer had carefully framed the shot to exclude any other figures, but Ethan now knew that Sarah Mitchell had likely been just outside the frame, as essential to the garden's success as the soil itself. During this period of separation, both Angela and Ethan found themselves drawn to the physical spaces that held their shared history. Angela would sometimes drive past the mansion after her hospital shifts, looking at the gardens that had once represented such hope and cooperation. Ethan began asking his physical therapist to take him to the gardens, where he would sit among the now ornamental flower beds, imagining them transformed into the productive plots of his grandmother's time. The distance between them grew in physical terms, but shortened in understanding. Each in their own way came to realize that the weight of history they had uncovered wasn't just a burden, it was also a blueprint. Their grandmothers had faced similar challenges, perhaps even greater ones, yet had found ways to maintain their connection and create meaningful change in their community. The morning Ethan decided to confront his family arrived with the kind of clarity that often follows prolonged internal struggle. He had spent weeks examining every facet of his life, every assumption he'd inherited along with his family name. The mansion's walls, which had once felt protective, now seemed to echo with the weight of unspoken truths and maintained appearances. Ethan arranged for a family meeting through his mother's secretary, knowing that the formality of the request would ensure everyone's attendance. The Parker family conducted even their most personal business with corporate precision, and this would be no different. He chose the mansion's main dining room as the setting, the same room where countless family decisions had been made over generations. The morning of the meeting, Ethan asked his physical therapist to help him dress in a full suit, complete with his father's old tie pin. The familiar weight of formal attire felt like armor as he positioned himself at the head of the table, where his father had once presided over family gatherings. One by one, they arrived: his mother Eleanor, his uncle Richard, who now served as company president, his Aunt Margaret, who managed the family's charitable foundation, and his cousin James, who sat on the hospital board. Their faces showed varying degrees of concern and curiosity. Eleanor had been making calls all morning to discover the purpose of this unexpected gathering. The family lawyer had been conspicuously uninvited, breaking with Parker tradition for serious family discussions. "Thank you for coming," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "I've asked you here because it's time we discuss some aspects of our family history that have been overlooked." He reached for a folder containing copies of the documents he and Angela had discovered, noting how his hands no longer trembled when handling these papers. As he began to share their findings about Elizabeth Parker's Victory Gardens and her collaboration with Sarah Mitchell, the reactions around the table shifted from polite interest to visible discomfort. Uncle Richard's face reddened when Ethan described how the gardens had provided food for families outside their social circle. Aunt Margaret's fingers drummed nervously against her water glass as he detailed the extent of the partnership between the two women. "This is ancient history," his uncle interrupted, attempting to dismiss the significance of the revelations. "Times were different during the war. Certain arrangements were necessary." Ethan held up the photograph of Elizabeth and Sarah together, the one that had started everything. "This wasn't just an arrangement," he countered. "This was a genuine partnership that continued long after the war ended. Our grandmother chose to work with someone she recognized as an equal, despite what society dictated at the time." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Darling, what exactly are you trying to accomplish with this historical review?" Her tone suggested she already knew and feared the answer. "I'm trying to show you that our family's real legacy isn't in our real estate holdings or our social position," Ethan replied, meeting each family member's gaze in turn. "It's in the courage to do what's right, even when society pushes against it." The silence that followed was profound. Ethan continued, revealing more details about their grandmother's collaboration during the polio outbreak and the flood crisis. With each new piece of evidence, he challenged the carefully maintained narrative of Parker family exclusivity and superiority. "The woman who discovered this history with me, Angela Reed, is Sarah Mitchell's granddaughter," he finally revealed. "And my feelings for her go beyond professional boundaries or historical interest. I need you all to understand that I'm not asking for permission or approval. I'm telling you that I've made my choice, just as grandmother Elizabeth made hers." The reactions exploded around the table. His uncle spoke of company image and shareholder confidence. His aunt raised concerns about donor reactions to their charitable foundation. His cousin mentioned hospital board politics. But it was his mother's silence that spoke loudest. When the others had exhausted their arguments, Eleanor finally spoke. "Your father would have," she began, then stopped herself. For the first time, Ethan saw uncertainty crack through her usual composure. "Actually, I don't know what your father would have said. He never spoke about his mother's activities during those years." "Maybe that was part of the problem," Ethan replied quietly. "We've spent generations not speaking about the things that matter most." He straightened in his wheelchair, feeling strength flow from his grandmother's legacy. "That ends today." The meeting concluded without resolution, but Ethan felt a profound shift had occurred. As his family members departed, their usual unified front showed signs of fracture. Some avoided his eyes, while others lingered as if wanting to say more but lacking the words. That evening, Ethan asked his driver to take him to Angela's apartment. The decision to confront his family had been only the first step. Now he needed to share his choice with the person who had helped him understand what choice really meant. The city's social circles buzzed with barely concealed whispers as Ethan and Angela began appearing together at community events. Their first public appearance came at a hospital fundraiser, where Ethan wheeled himself proudly beside Angela as she discussed their plans to revive the concept of community gardens in underserved neighborhoods. The crowd parted around them like water, creating pockets of murmured commentary and sharp glances. Angela felt every stare, every whispered word, but kept her head high as she had learned from stories of her grandmother's dignity. She wore a dress that her mother had made specially for the occasion, its fabric incorporating traditional African patterns in subtle, elegant ways. Ethan had noticed immediately, commenting on how it reminded him of the Victory Garden photographs where their grandmothers had stood their ground despite social pressure. Their community project began taking shape in an abandoned lot near the old Riverside district. The same area that had once flooded, causing their grandmothers to work together, would now host their vision of a modern Victory Garden. Ethan leveraged his business acumen to secure permits and funding, while Angela's connections in the community brought in volunteers and support from local organizations. The work wasn't easy. One morning, they arrived to find their newly installed irrigation system vandalized. Another day, anonymous complaints filed with the city threatened to halt their progress over technicalities. Each obstacle seemed designed to test their resolve, but these challenges only strengthened their determination. During a particularly difficult week, when corporate sponsors began withdrawing their support due to pressure from certain board members, Ethan received an unexpected visit from his cousin James. Unlike the rest of the family, James had been quietly observing the situation since the confrontational family meeting. "I've been looking through some old board minutes," James said, placing a folder on Ethan's desk. "Did you know that Grandmother Elizabeth had written several proposals for community development projects? They were all quietly shelved after she passed away." He paused, studying Ethan's reaction. "I think she would have approved of what you're doing now." The community garden project slowly transformed into something bigger than either of them had initially planned. Local schools began organizing field trips to learn about sustainable agriculture. Elderly residents shared stories about the original Victory Gardens, creating an oral history project that bridged generations. The garden became a living classroom where people from different backgrounds worked side by side, much as their grandmothers had done decades ago. Angela's professional colleagues at the hospital began to shift their attitudes as the project gained positive media attention. Dr. Thompson, who had once suggested reassigning her, now proudly showed visitors the hospital's partnership with the community garden, though he carefully avoided mentioning his earlier opposition. Even some members of the Parker family began to thaw. Aunt Margaret, who managed the family's charitable foundation, made an unannounced visit to the garden one afternoon. She watched silently as Angela taught a group of children about companion planting, using the same techniques Elizabeth Parker had documented in her wartime notes. Before leaving, Margaret left her business card with a handwritten note. "Let's discuss foundation support." The garden itself became a symbol of resistance against social prejudices, but it also served as a practical challenge to food insecurity in the neighborhood. They installed educational panels that told the story of the original Victory Gardens, including carefully restored photographs of Elizabeth Parker and Sarah Mitchell working together. These images, once hidden in family albums, now stood as public testimony to a legacy of cooperation across social boundaries. Yet the pressure of being symbols weighed heavily on both of them. Private moments became rare as their relationship drew constant public attention. Local news outlets began running features about the unlikely partnership behind the garden project, their words carefully chosen but their implications clear. Social media amplified both support and criticism, turning their personal journey into fodder for wider debates about class and race relations. One evening, as they sat together in the garden after a long day of work, Angela noticed Ethan watching a group of volunteers cleaning up for the day. The setting sun cast long shadows across the newly planted beds, reminiscent of the photograph that had started their journey. The volunteers represented a cross-section of the city: students, retirees, business people, and local residents, all working together just as their grandmothers had envisioned. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough," Angela said quietly, voicing the doubt that occasionally crept in despite their progress. The same prejudices still exist, just in different forms. Ethan reached for her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago. "We're not just gardening here," he replied, gesturing to the transformed space around them. "We're growing something our grandmothers planted long ago. Change takes time to root." The thread emerged during the community garden's first harvest festival. The event had drawn hundreds of visitors, transforming the once-abandoned lot into a vibrant celebration of community achievement. Children ran between rows of ripening vegetables while local chefs demonstrated cooking techniques using the garden's produce. The success of the day seemed to validate everything Ethan and Angela had worked toward. Then Bradley Parker, 3, arrived. Ethan's second cousin had always been the family's most aggressive defender of their social position, and his presence at the festival immediately changed the atmosphere. He moved through the crowd with calculated precision, his expensive suit out of place among the casual festival attendees, making his way toward the small stage where Angela was preparing to give a presentation about the garden's educational programs. "This has gone on long enough," Bradley announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. He held up a thick folder of documents, making sure the crowd could see it. "The public should know the truth about this arrangement." The pause before the last word carried echoes of Eleanor's earlier dismissal, but Bradley's tone held none of her restraint. Ethan wheeled himself forward, positioning himself between Bradley and Angela. The months of physical therapy had strengthened him, and he sat straight in his chair, every inch the businessman his father had raised him to be. "Whatever you think you know, Bradley, this isn't the place to discuss it." But Bradley had come prepared for confrontation. "Our grandmother's generation had their reasons for certain associations," he said, his voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd. "But let's be honest about what those reasons were. I have here documentation of payments made by Elizabeth Parker to Sarah Mitchell's family. This wasn't some noble partnership. It was a business arrangement, nothing more." Angela stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. The gesture wasn't lost on the onlookers. This simple touch defied decades of social boundaries. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We should be honest about the past. All of it." She turned to address the crowd directly, her professional experience as a nurse evident in her calm demeanor. "When we started this project, we discovered a history that some people would prefer to keep buried. But that history isn't just about two women from different backgrounds working together. It's about choices they made in a world that tried to keep them apart." Ethan picked up the thread, years of boardroom experience lending authority to his words. "The payments you found, Bradley, were Elizabeth Parker's way of circumventing the banks that wouldn't lend to Black businesses. She provided capital for Sarah Mitchell's husband to start his construction company, the same company that later helped rebuild the Riverside district after the flood." Bradley's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "The Parker family name stands for something in the city. We have a reputation to maintain. These revelations could damage decades of careful position building." He glanced meaningfully at the news reporters who had gathered to cover the festival. "Do you really want the public discussing how the Parker fortune is entangled with certain elements of society?" A new voice joined the confrontation. "I think it's time we discussed exactly that." James Parker emerged from the crowd, carrying his own set of documents. "I've spent the last few months going through our family archives, cousin. Would you like to explain to everyone why certain property deeds from the 1950s were backdated? Or why some of Grandmother Elizabeth's financial records were altered after her death?" The crowd murmured as Bradley's face reddened. He hadn't expected this counterattack, especially not from within the family. James continued, his voice gaining strength. "Our grandmother used her position to help create opportunities for others, even when it meant working around the prejudices of her time. That's the real Parker legacy, not the artificial social barriers you're so desperate to maintain." Angela moved to stand beside Ethan, both of them facing Bradley across the garden they had built together. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. They stood among the fruits of their labor, surrounded by the community they had helped bring together, their stance echoing the photograph that had started their journey. "We're not hiding anything," Ethan declared, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "In fact, we're planning to tell the whole story. Every document, every connection, every choice our grandmothers made. Because their story isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we make today." The confrontation had drawn everyone's attention, and in the tense silence that followed, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice shook with age, but carried the weight of lived experience. "I remember those Victory Gardens," she said. "My mother worked there with Mrs. Parker and Mrs. Mitchell. They gave us food when others turned us away. That's the truth worth telling." Bradley looked around, suddenly aware that the crowd's sympathy wasn't with him. His carefully planned exposure had transformed into something else entirely, a public affirmation of exactly what he had hoped to discredit. With as much dignity as he could muster, he turned and walked away, leaving his folder of documents behind. The video of the Harvest Festival confrontation spread across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. Someone had captured the entire exchange on their phone, from Bradley's arrival to the elderly woman's testimony. The footage showed not just the confrontation, but the garden itself, a vibrant testament to community collaboration that served as the perfect backdrop for their story. Within hours, news outlets began reaching out for interviews. Local stations led with the story, focusing initially on the social drama of a Parker heir and his nurse challenging generational prejudices. But as more details emerged about Elizabeth Parker and Sarah Mitchell's historical collaboration, the narrative deepened into something more meaningful. Angela and Ethan decided to take control of their story by recording a simple, honest video in the garden. They sat among the plants, the late afternoon sun casting the same angle of light captured in their grandmother's photograph. Ethan spoke first, his business polish softened by genuine emotion as he shared their discovery of the photograph and its implications. Angela followed, describing how their research had revealed not just a hidden family connection, but a model for addressing modern social divisions. The video ended with them holding up the original photograph of their grandmothers, now carefully preserved and framed. "This isn't just about the past," Angela explained, her voice steady and clear. It's about recognizing that the barriers between people are artificial and that they can be overcome when we choose to see each other as human beings first. Their story resonated far beyond their city. Social media exploded with similar stories of hidden historical connections and collaborations across social divides. Historians and genealogists began sharing documents showing how many supposedly separate communities had actually been deeply interconnected, their relationships obscured by the prejudices of their times. The pressure intensified as their story gained traction. Conservative media outlets questioned their motives, suggesting the entire project was a calculated attempt to force social change. Liberal platforms sometimes oversimplified their story into a romantic narrative that ignored its deeper implications. Both approaches missed the fundamental truth of what they had discovered, that meaningful change happens through sustained, practical collaboration rather than grand gestures. Eleanor Parker watched the media storm from her carefully maintained distance, but the constant coverage began to affect her in unexpected ways. One morning, she arrived at the garden unannounced, wearing clothes suitable for working outdoors, something no one had seen her do in decades. Without explanation, she began helping a group of volunteers harvest tomatoes, her perfectly manicured hands growing dirty with honest work. The hospital board, which had once pressured Angela to distance herself from Ethan, now approached them about expanding their community program. Dr. Thompson presented a proposal to create similar gardens at other healthcare facilities, though his enthusiasm seemed more aligned with the positive publicity than genuine conviction. Nevertheless, they accepted his support while maintaining their focus on the community's needs rather than institutional recognition. Their story's viral spread brought unexpected challenges. Social media activists began using their image without permission, sometimes to promote agendas that had little to do with their actual work. Privacy became increasingly difficult to maintain as people began visiting the garden hoping to catch glimpses of them together. Some visitors seemed more interested in creating social media content than engaging with the garden's purpose. The pressure of public attention began to wear on them. Angela found herself missing the quiet moments of their early research days, when discovery rather than documentation drove their interactions. Ethan struggled with the constant scrutiny of his every gesture and word, aware that each public appearance would be analyzed and interpreted by countless observers. Yet the viral spread of their story also created unprecedented opportunities for change. Other communities began reaching out for advice on starting similar projects. Historical societies offered to help document more stories of cross-cultural collaboration from the past. Young people, particularly those from backgrounds similar to Angela's, found inspiration in seeing someone like her stand firm against social pressure while maintaining her professional dignity. One evening, as they reviewed another set of interview requests, Angela noticed Ethan staring at his phone with an unusual expression. He showed her a social media post that had gone viral. Someone had colorized the old photograph of their grandmothers, bringing new life to that moment from the past. The enhanced image showed details they hadn't noticed before: the slight smile on Elizabeth Parker's face, the proud set of Sarah Mitchell's shoulders, the way they stood as equals despite their era's conventions. Sometimes I wonder what they would think of all this attention, Ethan mused, looking out over the garden where volunteers continued working despite the late hour. Would they be proud of what we're doing, or would they prefer their story remain private? Angela considered the question carefully, thinking of her grandmother's quiet strength and the discoveries they had made about Elizabeth Parker's behind-the-scenes support for change. I think they did what they needed to do in their time, she replied. Maybe our role is to show that their work wasn't just about survival or necessity, it was about showing a better way forward. The final piece of their shared history emerged during a tense family gathering at the Parker mansion. The annual shareholders' meeting had brought the extended family together, and the boardroom crackled with unresolved tension. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his position as majority shareholder finally feeling natural after months of standing his ground. The meeting had proceeded normally until the discussion turned to the company's new community investment initiatives. That's when Eleanor Parker rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted an old leather briefcase onto the table. The briefcase had belonged to her late husband, Ethan's father, and had remained locked in his study since his death. Eleanor had always refused to open it, honoring what she believed was her husband's wish for privacy. But the events of recent months had changed her perspective on family secrets. "Before we continue," Eleanor began, her voice steadier than her hands, "there's something you all need to know." She withdrew a stack of letters, their paper yellowed with age. "I found these last week when I finally opened your father's private papers, Ethan. They're from your grandfather to your grandmother Elizabeth, written while he was away on business trips." The room fell silent as Eleanor began to read. The letters revealed that Ethan's grandfather had discovered Elizabeth's collaboration with Sarah Mitchell by accident. Instead of opposing it, as everyone might have expected, he had become a silent supporter of their work. His letters spoke of pride in Elizabeth's courage and vision, though he acknowledged the need to keep their activities discreet in those challenging times. But the most stunning revelation came near the end of the letters. Ethan's grandfather wrote about a young woman who had caught his eye before he met Elizabeth, a woman who had been deemed unsuitable due to her race. The woman was Sarah Mitchell's sister. He had chosen to follow social conventions and marry Elizabeth instead, but his letters suggested this early experience had shaped his quiet support for his wife's later partnership with Sarah. As Eleanor read the final letter, Ethan noticed Angela's hands gripping the arms of her chair. The connection they had discovered wasn't just about their grandmother's collaboration. It was about a deeper human bond that had been denied by the prejudices of the time. Their own relationship wasn't just challenging social conventions. It was fulfilling a connection that should have been possible generations ago. The revelation rippled through the boardroom. Bradley Parker III, who had tried to discredit their work at the Harvest Festival, sat in stunned silence. Other family members exchanged glances that spoke of reevaluated family stories and questioned assumptions. James, who had already been supportive, smiled slightly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Angela stood up, her professional composure momentarily overcome by emotion. "My grandmother, you said to say that love finds a way to bridge any divide," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. She never explained exactly what she meant, but I think now we understand. Ethan reached for her hand, no longer concerned about the family's reaction to this public display of affection. "Our grandmothers created something remarkable in their time," he said, addressing the room. "They found a way to work together despite every obstacle society placed in their path. But they had to hide much of what they accomplished. We don't have to hide anymore." The impact of this revelation extended far beyond the boardroom. As the story of their family's intertwined history became public, it catalyzed conversations about historical connections that had been obscured or denied. Historians began researching similar partnerships across the country, revealing a network of relationships that had quietly challenged social boundaries throughout the decades. The Parker family's corporate archives were open to researchers, revealing more evidence of Elizabeth Parker's progressive activities. The Family Foundation, under Margaret's leadership, established a scholarship program for students studying social justice and community development. Even Bradley eventually came around, offering to fund an expansion of the community garden project to other neighborhoods. But perhaps the most profound change was personal. Eleanor Parker, who had once epitomized rigid social boundaries, began hosting Sunday dinners that included Angela's entire family. These gatherings were awkward at first, decades of social conditioning creating invisible barriers. But over time, the warmth of shared meals and stories began to break down these walls. Angela and Ethan married in the community garden they had built together, standing among the plants that symbolized growth and renewal. The ceremony combined elements from both their families' traditions, creating something new while honoring the past. During the celebration, they unveiled a permanent installation telling the complete story of their grandmother's partnership, including the newly discovered letters and the truth about the connection that had been denied. The garden continued to flourish, but it was no longer just about growing food. It had become a living monument to the power of human connection over artificial divisions. School groups visited to learn about both agriculture and history. Community members shared stories of their own family histories, revealing more hidden connections that had shaped the city's development. As they stood together at the garden's first anniversary celebration, Ethan and Angela realized that their discovery of that old photograph had done more than reveal a hidden history. It had created a new legacy, one that would make it easier for future generations to choose love and understanding over prejudice and separation. Their grandmothers had planted the seeds of change in secret. Ethan and Angela had helped those seeds finally bloom in the open air.